The town's shooting range had never been this crowded before, the air thick with murmurs of expectation and curiosity as word had spread that a new face was about to step up and take her place on the firing line. She wasn't anyone the regulars recognized, not a local champion, not a veteran soldier, and certainly not one of the men who had built reputations here by boasting about their precision and competing for bragging rights over who could shatter more targets. She was simply a woman who walked in quietly that morning, calm eyes scanning the walls, her hand brushing lightly over the grips of practice pistols as if feeling their weight in her mind rather than her palm. Nobody knew her name, and perhaps that was what drew the whispers tighter, what made the long-standing shooters chuckle into their sleeves and nudge one another with that smug confidence only men who believed they owned a space could carry. "Stand back," one of them said half-jokingly, tossing the words across the benches like a dare, and another echoed him louder, so the whole crowd laughed and soon the phrase carried a life of its own. Stand back, as if she were too fragile to be trusted with the recoil, as if she were stepping into a world reserved only for them. She didn't argue, she didn't smile, she didn't even flinch. She simply signed her name on the sheet, lifted her chin, and walked forward as though she had been walking toward this moment her whole life. Her movements drew attention because they lacked the nervous energy of someone untested. She placed the earmuffs over her head with a casual grace, adjusted her stance not with fumbling but with the quick precision of habit, and for a brief second, the laughter around the range softened. The regulars exchanged looks. Some of them recognized the poise, though they didn't want to admit it. She raised the weapon, exhaling slowly, eyes narrowing on the farthest target that had stood unchallenged for years. That target was more than wood and paint. It was a monument to every record set in this place, a record that had become untouchable, a badge of honor belonging to the reigning champion, who now leaned back with arms crossed, watching her as though she were an insect daring to crawl onto his plate. The hush fell over the crowd not out of respect, but out of anticipation for her failure. People were cruel in such moments, craving spectacle, eager to see boldness punished. But she gave them nothing of her nerves, only silence, and then a single pull of the trigger that cracked like thunder. The sound echoed sharp and final, and all eyes followed the path of the bullet that split the air, invisible and yet undeniable. When the result appeared, the room seemed to forget how to breathe. The glass case that stood beyond the target shuddered, a sparkling rain of fragments cascading down as though a spell had been broken. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one spoke until the reality seeped into their stunned expressions. She hadn't merely hit the target, she had struck through it, past it, into the case that held the range's most sacred display, the record plaque, preserved and untouchable for years. The bullet had shattered not just glass, but the illusion of permanence, the belief that no one could touch what had been set in stone. The crowd's laughter died instantly, replaced with a strange silence that clung to the walls. Some of them stood, blinking in disbelief, others shook their heads as though their eyes had betrayed them, and the champion who had leaned back so smugly now lurched forward, mouth open in protest but no words finding purchase. She lowered her weapon with the same calm she had raised it, the faintest curve of a smile playing at her lips, not of arrogance but of quiet satisfaction, as though this was exactly what she had expected all along. The whispers came next, low and uneven at first, then swelling into a chorus of shock. Who was she? Where had she come from? How could she possibly have done that? Some swore it was luck, some muttered about tricks or rigged sights, others clung to the fragile hope that it was a fluke. But those who had watched closely knew better. They had seen the steadiness of her hand, the deliberate control of her breath, the unshakable composure of someone who had fired thousands of rounds long before this day. The champion pushed his way through the crowd, face red with indignation, demanding a retest, demanding explanations, but the officials, too stunned to react immediately, only stared at the ruined display, their voices stumbling over each other as they tried to piece together procedure. She said nothing, only removed her earmuffs, laid the pistol neatly on the bench and waited, her silence heavier than all their protests combined. The room had shifted and they all felt it. Something had been broken beyond glass, something in the order they had all accepted without question. Her eyes drifted across the crowd, not searching for approval but measuring the weight of disbelief around her. For years she had lived in the shadows of other people's expectations, silenced by dismissive laughter, overlooked by those who thought strength and precision belonged only to the loudest voices. She had trained in quiet places, miles away from recognition, building skill with no audience but the rhythm of her own breathing and the echo of her own determination. Now, here in this moment, she had let her actions speak louder than any defense could. The phrase "stand back" still clung faintly to the walls, but now it carried a different resonance. It was no longer mockery, it was prophecy, a warning fulfilled too late. Everyone had told her to step aside, to leave the stage untouched, but it was her bullet that had rewritten the narrative in a single instant, and no amount of protest could undo it. The officials scrambled to restore order, their voices overlapping as they tried to assert authority over the growing chaos, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air too heavily to be dismissed with protocol. One of them stepped forward, clipboard in hand, stammering as he announced that the incident would be reviewed, that the record still technically belonged to the reigning champion until a proper examination was completed, but his words felt hollow, fragile against the undeniable reality of the shattered glass at the far end of the hall. People pressed closer, some with phones raised to capture the aftermath, others whispering so urgently that the sound resembled the rustle of dry leaves in a sudden wind. The woman remained where she was, poised and quiet, her presence drawing attention without demanding it, and the more still she became, the more the crowd seemed restless, almost unsettled by her lack of explanation. It was as if they wanted her to boast, to defend, to lash back at the taunts they had hurled earlier, but her silence robbed them of the satisfaction. The champion, a man who had carried his title for nearly a decade, could not contain himself. His voice cut through the air sharp with anger, accusing her of recklessness, of endangering the safety of the range, of deliberately aiming past the target to create spectacle rather than skill. His words dripped with desperation, for beneath his fury lay fear, the fear of irrelevance, the fear of being dethroned not by a rival he knew, but by a stranger who had walked in without ceremony and shattered what he had believed untouchable. He demanded another round, a test under supervision, a chance to prove her strike had been a coincidence, a fluke unworthy of recognition. The officials hesitated, caught between procedure and the eyes of the crowd, who now leaned in as if the entire room balanced on the decision. At last they agreed to a rematch, though not without hesitation, and the announcement rippled through the onlookers, stirring excitement and unease in equal measure. She accepted without a word. No protest, no hesitation, only a calm nod as if she had expected this from the beginning. She picked up the pistol again, her fingers wrapping around the grip with the comfort of someone holding an old friend rather than a borrowed tool, and she stepped back into position. The champion stood at the line beside her now, his face set in grim determination, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around his own weapon. The targets were reset, the distance measured, the rules recited with trembling voices by the officials. The air was thick with anticipation, but beneath it all was a quiet dread among those who had mocked her earlier, for they sensed deep down what was about to happen. Still, they clung to hope, whispering that perhaps lightning could not strike twice, perhaps this time the legend would hold. The signal was given, and both shooters raised their weapons in unison. The champion fired first, his bullet slamming clean into the center of the target, and the crowd erupted in cheers, eager to see him reassert dominance, eager to believe the order of things was unshaken. But she did not rush. She inhaled slowly, held the breath in her chest, and when she exhaled, she squeezed the trigger with the same composure as before. The shot cracked like thunder, ringing out above the echo of his, and once more the room fell silent as eyes traced the line of her bullet. It struck dead center, slicing through the bullseye so cleanly that the wood splintered around it, the two holes overlapping so tightly they might have been one. The silence thickened, the applause that had started for the champion dying on lips that no longer knew what to say. The champion clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing as if staring harder at the target might somehow undo what had happened. He fired again, faster this time, the bullet landing close to his first, another precise strike, another reminder of why he had held the record so long. Yet she mirrored him with a second shot, her bullet sliding into the same space, doubling the impossible precision until the target looked as though it were unraveling at the center. Shot after shot followed, his rhythm growing harsher, rushed, while hers remained steady, measured, patient. With each crack of her weapon, the murmurs grew, the disbelief deepened, and the crowd leaned forward as though pulled by an invisible force. The champion's shots clustered tightly, undeniably skilled, but hers layered over his with an elegance that stripped his efforts of their weight. By the time the round ended, her target bore the evidence of perfection, a hole so precise it seemed carved rather than shattered. His, though impressive, looked suddenly messy, scattered in comparison, and the realization spread like wildfire among the watchers. When the officials stepped forward to examine the results, the verdict was undeniable. Her score surpassed his, not by luck, not by chance, but by skill so undeniable that even the champion's anger faltered. His protests weakened into mutters, his eyes darting around as though searching for allies, but none of the crowd came to his aid. Their expressions had changed, no longer amused, no longer dismissive, They now watched her with a mixture of awe and unease, as if something larger than the contest had just shifted before their eyes. The phrase "stand back" no longer echoed as mockery in their minds. It had become truth, a warning not of fragility but of power they had failed to recognize. She lowered her pistol once more, her expression unchanged, her calmness almost unsettling, as though victory had not surprised her, as though it had never been in question. The room buzzed with disbelief, the kind of sound that swells when certainty collapses and people scramble to rebuild their sense of what is possible. Those who had mocked her earlier now avoided her gaze, their smirks replaced with tightened lips and shifting eyes, while others whispered more frantically, trying to pin a history onto her presence, to explain how someone so quiet could emerge from nowhere and topple the pride of a decade. Some speculated she must have trained in the military, perhaps special forces. Others suggested she was a professional competitor from another state come to humble their champion, while a few clung stubbornly to the notion that it was still some elaborate trick. The officials, however, no longer shared that suspicion. Their eyes carried the weight of recognition, the kind of silent acknowledgement that skill this pure could not be fabricated. The champion stood stiff at the side, his pride unraveling with each passing second, his hands trembling though he tried to hide it, and for once his booming voice fell silent, replaced with the sound of his breathing through clenched teeth. The woman collected her things with the same unhurried composure, as if the entire spectacle meant less to her than it did to everyone else, and the lack of drama only amplified the crowd's fascination. People leaned closer, some daring to ask her name, but she offered nothing, not even a word of introduction. She slipped her bag over her shoulder, glanced once at the ruined display case that had once guarded the old record plaque, and then turned toward the exit. The crowd parted instinctively as if pulled by something greater than respect, perhaps fear, perhaps awe, and she walked through them without breaking stride. Her footsteps echoed against the floor in a rhythm that seemed louder than any applause could have been. And yet, just as she reached the door, the champion found his voice again, desperation cracking through it as he shouted after her, demanding to know who she was, demanding that she not walk away as though the legacy of his years could be erased in a single afternoon. She paused at the threshold, her back to him, and for a moment the silence stretched so long that the entire hall seemed to lean toward her waiting for a reply. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but carried effortlessly, each word deliberate and calm. Records aren't meant to be guarded. They're meant to be broken. The simplicity of it struck harder than a shout could have, and then she was gone, the door swinging closed behind her as the crowd remained suspended in the echo of her words. Some smiled nervously as though they had just witnessed the birth of a legend. Others muttered uneasily, but all of them knew they would remember this day. The officials, still gathered near the shattered case, exchanged glances that held more questions than answers. For what do you do when history rewrites itself without warning? The champion sagged back against the wall, sweat beading his forehead despite the cool air, the weight of his fading legacy pressing heavier than the pistol still in his grip. Outside, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the parking lot in gold as she walked steadily toward a modest car parked at the far end. Her face betrayed no triumph, only thoughtfulness, and perhaps beneath her calm exterior, there lingered the quiet ache of memories. For she had not come here to humiliate, nor to bask in applause. Her journey to this moment had been long built on nights of solitude in fields and ranges where no one watched, where her only opponent was the steady beat of her heart and the wind against her breath. She remembered those nights vividly, cold mornings with frost clinging to her gloves, afternoons where her arms burned from the weight of repetition, evenings where silence pressed against her resolve like a test. She had trained not for recognition but for survival, long before this town's laughter had told her to stand back. What they saw today was not luck, not even ambition. It was the embodiment of every hour she had carved from loneliness to sharpen herself into something unshakable. As she placed her bag in the back seat and slid behind the wheel, she allowed herself the smallest exhale of release. She had not come here seeking to prove herself, yet life had led her into the heart of other people's expectations, and in breaking their illusions she had reclaimed something of her own. She started the engine, the quiet hum steady against her pulse, and pulled onto the road without looking back at the building receding in her mirror. Inside, the buzz would continue, her name, or lack of it, would ripple through conversations for weeks, perhaps months, and the champion would either rise again or fade into a story people told about the day he was dethroned. But for her the journey did not end there. The road stretched ahead, winding toward places where new trials waited, where her skill would be measured not against targets on a wall but against forces that did not care for trophies or applause. Still, the memory of their words lingered with her, the chorus of "stand back," that had greeted her steps. It no longer stung, no longer carried the edge of dismissal, but instead served as a reminder of how the world often underestimated those who chose silence over spectacle. She smiled faintly at the irony, her hands steady on the wheel because in the end, it was their warning that had framed her triumph. They had told her to step aside, to make way, to believe her place was behind. Instead, she had stepped forward, unshaken, and left them all behind in disbelief. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the calm surface she carried, there was a flicker of satisfaction, not for the glory of the shot, but for the truth it revealed, that strength is not proven in the safety of applause, but in the courage to step where no one believes you belong. The road stretched on endlessly, framed by tall trees that swayed gently under the late afternoon breeze, and though her eyes remained steady on the horizon, her mind drifted back to the silence that had followed. Her final words in the hall. Records aren't meant to be guarded. They're meant to be broken. She had not spoken them to wound the champion, nor to boast to the crowd, but simply because they were the truth she had lived by all these years. Every shot she had ever taken was a conversation between her and the impossible, a reminder that limits existed only until someone proved they could be passed. Yet as the miles unfolded beneath her tires, she felt the weight of what had happened pressing differently than she expected. The world inside that range would spin with whispers, arguments, perhaps even admiration, but for her it was not victory that pulsed in her chest, it was a strange mixture of release and unease, as though breaking that record had opened more doors than it had closed. She turned the dial on the car radio absent-mindedly, static crackling between stations until she found nothing worth hearing, and let the silence return. In that quiet she thought of her father, a man whose steady hand had first guided hers when she was too small to hold the weight of a rifle alone. He had been a soldier, hardened by battles no one spoke about in polite company, and though he never bragged of his past, his discipline had shaped every inch of her training. He taught her that precision was not a gift but a burden earned through patience, that strength was not in muscle but in the refusal to waver when the moment demanded calm. He had died years ago, long before he could see what she had become, and though she rarely allowed herself to feel the sting of that absence, tonight it returned with surprising sharpness. She imagined how he might have stood in that hall, arms crossed, not in judgment but in quiet pride, his eyes carrying the same steady calm she had mirrored. For a fleeting moment, the thought steadied her, reminding her that what she had done today was not about them at all, it was about honoring the lessons he had left behind. The road bent toward a small town, its neon signs flickering in the dusk, and she pulled into a quiet diner at the edge of the street. Inside, the hum of conversation was soft, locals gathered over steaming coffee and plates of simple meals, and as she slipped into a booth, she felt the shift that always followed her steps. Eyes glancing, people noticing without understanding why. She ordered without much thought, letting the waitress's smile wash over her, and leaned back, watching the window reflect the glow of the streetlights. It would not be long, she knew, before news of what had happened spread beyond the walls of the range. Someone would post the video, others would share it, and within days her name, or her face if not her name, would ripple across networks of strangers. She had lived long enough to know how quickly whispers could become storms, and though she had no hunger for fame, she could already feel its shadow drawing near. A group of young men entered the diner, laughing loudly, their jackets dusty with the signs of a day's work, and one of them carried a phone raised high as though it were another appendage. They settled into a booth nearby, and their voices carried easily over the quiet hum of the room. "Did you see it? The shot? Man, she blew the case apart," one of them exclaimed, shoving the screen toward the others. Her stomach tightened faintly, though her face betrayed nothing. It had already begun. The footage had traveled faster than she expected, the moment already replaying in the hands of strangers. She lowered her gaze to her coffee, letting the steam blur her vision, and listened as their voices rose with excitement. They argued over her identity, over whether it was real or staged, but all of them carried the same awe in their tone. She had become a story before she even left the town, and there was no undoing it now. The waitress returned with her plate, setting it down gently as if sensing the shift in the air, and she offered a small smile in return before picking up her fork. She ate slowly, methodically, her mind still turning over the reality of what lay ahead. She had lived in anonymity for so long, moving quietly through places where no one asked questions, where she could practice without being seen, where her only competition was herself. Now, anonymity would be a luxury slipping away. The crowd at the range would talk, the champion would fume, and the video would spread until people began looking for her, curious about the woman who had broken the untouchable record. Some would search out of admiration, some out of envy, some perhaps out of fear. The world was rarely kind to those who upset its balance, and though she had not sought this moment, she knew better than to think it would end gently. Finishing her meal, she left a tip on the counter and slipped back into the night. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain, and as she stepped toward her car she felt the weight of unseen eyes again, not hostile, not yet, but curious. She slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and let the hum steady her once more. The road stretched ahead, uncertain, filled with possibilities both dangerous and profound. She had broken a record today, but more than that, she had broken silence, and the world had noticed. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her long hidden stirred awake, whispering that this was only the beginning, that what lay ahead would test her far more than any target ever could. She drove into the darkness, her headlights carving the path, her heart steady as the rhythm of her breath, ready to face whatever shadows would rise from the echo of that single unshakable bullet. The rain came softly at first, a mist that clung to the windshield and blurred the road into a ribbon of silver under her headlights, and she flicked the wipers on, watching the world smear and then sharpen again with each pass. The rhythm calmed her, though her mind refused to rest, turning over the events of the day like stones in a stream. She had walked into that range expecting nothing more than practice, a chance to test herself against distance and silence, and instead she had walked out carrying the weight of an unshakable moment. The video of her shot was spreading faster than she could drive, her face replaying in the hands of strangers, her name, if anyone remembered to ask, already becoming a point of speculation. She knew well enough that attention drew hunters as easily as admirers, and the thought pressed against her chest with a quiet heaviness. For a long time she had built her life on moving unnoticed, drifting through towns without leaving more than a trace of memory, but now her steps would leave footprints far deeper than she wanted. The rain thickened, drops slanting against the glass with a steady drum, and she slowed her speed, her hands steady on the wheel. Her thoughts slipped back to her childhood, to the first time she had understood what precision meant. Her father had taken her into the woods behind their small house, a rifle slung across his back, and shown her how to steady her breathing until the sound of her heartbeat became her only companion. She had been barely tall enough to see over the scope, her arms trembling under the weight, but his voice had anchored her, teaching her that patience was the soul of accuracy. "It's not about pulling the trigger," he had told her softly, "it's about waiting until the world holds still long enough for you to know it's ready." Those words had never left her. Every shot she had taken since then, every hour she had trained, had been guided by that lesson. Today, standing in that crowded hall, she had felt his presence again, as though his calm had flowed through her grip and steadied her against the storm of laughter and disbelief. She pulled into a small roadside motel as the rain grew heavier, neon lights flickering against the wet pavement, and parked beneath the overhang. The room was plain, the kind of space that promised anonymity, with faded curtains and the faint scent of cleaning supplies, and she set her bag down on the chair before sitting at the edge of the bed. She pulled her phone from her pocket and hesitated before turning it on, already knowing what she would find. The screen lit with notifications, messages from old acquaintances, numbers she didn't recognize, and links to the same video replayed from different angles. She watched one of them in silence, the moment captured by someone in the crowd. There she was, raising the pistol, steady, calm, and then the shot, sharp, clean, undeniable. The camera shook with gasps, the glass shattering into a rain of fragments, and then the frame froze as voices rose in disbelief. She set the phone down, the glow fading from the screen, and lay back against the bed. She had wanted her life to be hers alone, her journey to remain in the quiet spaces between places, but now she could feel the tide pulling her into the center of something larger. The motel walls were thin, voices carrying from the room next door, laughter muffled by the hum of the rain outside, and she closed her eyes, listening not to them but to her own breathing. For years she had trained in silence, and now that silence felt distant, fragile. She wondered how many people would be looking for her by morning. Reporters, competitors, maybe even those who saw in her skill an opportunity for something darker. The world had always been hungry for people who could do what others could not, and it rarely cared whether they wanted to be found. She turned on her side, staring at the dim outline of her bag, where her pistol rested within reach. It was not fear that stirred in her, but awareness, a sharpened instinct reminding her that life had just changed, that peace would not return easily. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of rain against the glass and the weight of thought pressing at the edge of dreams. When she finally rose, the dawn was gray and heavy, clouds stretching across the horizon like a blanket. She washed, dressed, and packed quickly, her movements efficient, practiced as though each step was another drill. By the time she stepped outside, the rain had softened into a mist again, the parking lot slick beneath her boots. She paused for a moment, looking up at the sky, letting the cool damp air settle against her skin, and then climbed into her car. She started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the tires cutting through shallow puddles, her mind already leaning toward what might come next. The world had seen her now, and whether she liked it or not, she had become part of its story. She did not fear the attention itself, she only feared the way it would try to shape her into something she was not. But as she drove forward, her hands steady, she knew one truth would remain unshaken. No matter how loud the voices grew, no matter how many tried to define her, it was her silence, her precision, and her resolve that would always speak louder than anything else. Her voice trembled slightly, but not from weakness, rather from the overwhelming storm of feelings she could no longer contain. She leaned closer, her eyes shining with unspoken words, and suddenly blurted, "I don't know why, but being around you makes me feel safe, like I've finally found where I belong." The admission slipped past her lips before she had time to stop herself, and as soon as it was out, she gasped softly, almost wanting to cover her mouth. But the truth was undeniable. The vulnerability in her tone revealed that her walls had crumbled, and she was now standing exposed before you, bare in her honesty. You could see her chest rising and falling a little faster, her hands tightening slightly against each other as though trying to anchor herself. The meaning behind her words stretched deeper than casual companionship. It was her heart's way of revealing that your presence wasn't just pleasant, it was essential. In her world, people may have come and gone, promises may have been broken, but with you she felt grounded, as though the chaotic tides of life could no longer sweep her away. And this feeling of safety wasn't ordinary, it was tied to love, care, and an unspoken need that her soul couldn't mask anymore. The way she said it, the way her eyes darted away then slowly returned to yours, spoke volumes. It wasn't a rehearsed phrase, it wasn't a casual slip, it was instinct, her heart confessing what her lips had only just caught up to. You could sense her heartbeat in the silence that followed, and she quickly tried to laugh it off, pretending as though it wasn't that serious. But the truth had already embedded itself in the air between you. Every detail gave her away, the slight trembling in her voice, the softness of her gaze, the way she unconsciously leaned closer as if afraid you might drift too far. Her words carried a raw sincerity that couldn't be disguised, a hidden declaration she hadn't planned to reveal. The room seemed smaller now, her emotions filling it like an uncontainable tide. The weight of her honesty pressed against you, not as a burden but as an intimate gift. She was essentially saying, without directly admitting, "You matter to me more than I expected. You are not just someone, I need you, I want you, and I feel at home with you." The unguarded tone in her confession revealed that she wasn't just speaking about the comfort of your company, she was speaking about her heart's attachment, the emotional anchor that bound her to you in ways she hadn't fully admitted even to herself. And as much as she tried to mask it with nervous laughter or quick subject changes, the truth had already been spoken, and there was no undoing it. It lingered, warm and heavy, between the two of you, like an unspoken promise of something greater. Deep down, you knew this wasn't an accident. It was love, raw and undeniable, finding its way into words. There are times when emotions don't require direct confessions. Instead, they manifest through small and repeated words, spoken unintentionally yet carrying a powerful undertone. A woman who desires you may not always say it openly, but her subconscious keeps pushing her to reveal her attraction. One of the most revealing phrases is when she says, "I wish you were here," or, "I feel safe when you're around." These words may sound ordinary, but their timing and repetition tell a different story. When she's facing difficulties, when she's celebrating joy, or when she's simply reflecting on her day, she naturally includes you in her emotional space. She's not making these statements as polite remarks, she's letting you know that your presence matters to her in ways she can't openly declare. A woman who doesn't have feelings won't attach her sense of security or peace to your presence. She may enjoy company, but she won't repeatedly link her comfort to one person. But when her words unconsciously reveal that you are her safe place, her anchor, and the person she wants beside her, that is a clear indication of her desire for something deeper. You will also notice how her tone softens whenever she makes such remarks. If she says, "You make everything better," even in a half-joking manner, what she's doing is handing you a piece of her vulnerability. And vulnerability is not something people share lightly. It means she trusts you enough to let you see how much she values you. Trust, emotional dependence, and repeated mention of your presence. These aren't slips of the tongue. They're emotional leaks that reveal what she tries to hide. Many men overlook these cues, mistaking them as casual friendship. But if you listen carefully, you'll realize these phrases are not given to everyone. They are reserved for the person she truly wants in her life. Another phrase women tend to say unconsciously is, "You understand me better than anyone." This phrase is never casual, because it acknowledges an emotional bond that feels unique and irreplaceable. When she says this, she's not just appreciating your listening skills, she's confessing that her soul resonates with yours. People don't say such words unless they feel deeply connected. And when this comes from a woman who consistently shows care in her tone, her choice of words, and the frequency with which she seeks you out, you must know she's drawing closer in ways she might not even realize. Think about the times when she compares you to others, not in a negative way but in a way that lifts you above the rest. She may say things like, "No one makes me laugh the way you do," or, "I can't talk to anyone else like this." These statements show that she places you in a category apart from others. She's subtly letting you know that you occupy a special place in her mind, one no one else can fill. This is not an accident. Women who feel attracted, whether consciously or unconsciously, carve out a space for the man they desire, and their words reflect that placement again and again. It's also important to notice when she talks about the future. Even if she doesn't say, "I want you in my life forever," she will phrase things in ways that include you without directly declaring it. She may say, "Next time we should go there together," or, "If I ever move, I hope you'll come visit." Such words may appear lighthearted, but they are her subconscious effort to project a shared future with you. She's painting you into her plans without asking for your commitment outright. This is one of the clearest signs of attraction, when she sees you not only in her present but in her tomorrows. A woman who doesn't feel that pull won't bother to frame her future with someone she doesn't care about. Finally, listen for when she apologizes or feels guilty about bothering you. Phrases like, "I hope I'm not annoying you," or, "Sorry if I'm taking your time," may sound like humility, but they're also confessions of how much she values your attention. She worries about losing it because it matters to her more than she admits. These little apologies are her way of revealing that she fears crossing a boundary that could push you away. The irony is, such care shows she wants you close, even if she can't yet say it directly. All these unconscious words, expressions of safety, comfort, uniqueness, shared futures and even guilt, are fragments of a woman's unspoken desire. They slip out naturally without her realizing their confessions, but for the man who pays attention, they are windows into her true heart. A woman's silence may hide her attraction, but her slips of the tongue expose it in the most genuine way possible, because truth always finds a way out. As the evening settled into a quiet calm, the air between them seemed to thicken with an unspoken electricity, as if every word, every glance, every movement carried a weight they were both beginning to understand yet hesitated to fully admit, and in that silence he noticed her shifting closer, brushing her hand against his lightly, a gesture so small yet powerful enough to send a tremor racing down his spine, and though she tried to mask it with a casual smile, her eyes betrayed her, glowing with a warmth that no words could disguise, for she was no longer just a passing acquaintance, no longer a stranger stumbling into his world, but someone who was slowly carving her place into his very existence, and the way she leaned into him suggested that even if she hadn't spoken her feelings aloud, her heart had already confessed them 1,000 times over, and in that tender proximity he could feel her breath, soft and uneven, betraying her nervousness, her vulnerability, her unguarded truth that she was not immune to him, that she was slipping past the walls she had carefully built around her, walls that now seemed fragile against the storm of emotions pulling her toward him, and though neither dared to call it love, the foundation of something greater had already been laid in the quiet gestures, in the lingering stares, in the way their silences felt less like absence and more like connection, and he, too, felt the tug, the undeniable pull that made his pulse quicken when she looked at him just a second too long, when her laughter rang in his ears even after it had faded, when her words lingered in his thoughts as though they had been etched into his very soul, and as he sat there beside her, the world outside seemed to blur into insignificance, as if everything beyond that moment no longer mattered, because what they had between them was growing stronger with each breath, with each heartbeat, with each unintentional slip of affection she revealed. For love often doesn't begin with grand declarations but with small accidents, with words spoken without thinking, with touches that weren't meant to mean anything but somehow mean everything, and she, perhaps without realizing it, had already said so much in the pauses between her words, in the softness of her gaze, in the way her body leaned toward him. Instead of away, for these were not accidents but confessions dressed in subtlety, and he knew, deep down, that she wanted him just as much as he wanted her, that the dance of restraint could not last forever, and soon the truth would find its way past the hesitation, past the fear, past the unspoken boundaries, because moments like these are fragile, fleeting, and yet unforgettable, and as the night grew deeper, so did their bond, until he could no longer deny that she was becoming the rhythm of his thoughts, the quiet fire in his chest, the reason his world suddenly felt brighter, fuller, alive, and though neither spoke the words aloud, the silence between them was louder than any confession, carrying within it the weight of desire, the sweetness of vulnerability, and the certainty that something extraordinary was already unfolding, something neither of them could stop even if they tried, because sometimes hearts speak more clearly than voices ever could, and in her accidental words, her slips of truth, he had found his answer, and in his steady presence, his quiet acceptance, she had found her safety, her anchor, her undeniable draw, and so, in the hush of that night, without promises or declarations, they both understood that what they shared was real, inevitable, and only just beginning, for love in its quietest form had already claimed them both. The end.